Wonderful. So are we just ready to get started?
Yes.
Awesome. Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to this week's Talk for Future. Today, we will be discussing the important and very relevant topic of climate refugees, as well as their connection to climate change and, at large, the climate movement. My name is Evan Charlerton.
And I'm Alda. Today we will have two guests on with us. Firstly, Erica Bauer, who is a researcher on climate change, disasters and human mobility, as well as formerly a policy specialist on climate change displacement at the UN Refugee Agency. We also have Michael Bakas, who is an environmental and human rights activist in Lesbos, Greece. It's an honor to speak to you.
So just to start off, we have a question for you both. What is your personal connection to this topic, and why is it important to you? If we could start off with if we could start off with Erica first.
Sure. Well, I first became interested in this topic of climate change and human mobility in 2013. I was a climate passionate activist, very, very similar to yourselves, and I was trying to figure out where in this climate movement I fit in. I was working in Nepal, and in a very remote part of the Upper Mustang district in the Himalayas, I met a woman who changed my life. She told me that because of prolonged water insecurity, she had no source of water. There was a long drought, desertification, windstorms. Her village of Day Village could no longer remain in their ancestral lands. They had to move, they had to relocate as an entire community down to Jomsom. And in that moment, I realized that climate change is not this abstract future hypothetical that will only affect distant places. It is very much a current reality. And I realized that climate change was actually a driver of human movement. The same way that my ancestors were uprooted because of pogroms in Russia or the Irish potato famine, this woman too had to flee her home because of a climate crisis. So that was 7 years ago, and I've been working on this topic ever since. I think it was a real moment when I realized climate change has a human face. It's not just melting polar bears on melting ice caps or Keeling curves and statistics.
My studies were in environmental science, so the past 13 years I was involved actually as an activist in environmental issues. I live on the island of Lesbos. It's a crossroad of ecosystems, of natural environment between Asia and Europe. So we are lucky that we can see this change of the landscapes, change of ecosystems the past millions of years. On my island, you can see a petrified forest, but you can see also ruins of the past 15 million years. So the island was always a crossroad, as I said before, of flora, of fauna, but of humans also. And the past, especially 15 years, we have seen that thousands of people have tried and crossed the island, and they are moving to a better life, moving from Asia to Europe. So it's not difficult to understand that the climate crisis is also something that it will cause a big movement of people around around the world, as we have seen that happening for thousands of years. But we are afraid that the numbers now and the scale will be much bigger, and we must try hard to save the earth, to save the environment, but also to try to think what we can do with humans, with people living in places that they have a lot of problems, and try to deal with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now, Erica, why don't you start with your presentation?
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah, we
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you again to the organizers and the Fridays for Future movement for all of the inspiring work that you do and for inviting me to speak today. In this presentation, I'll talk a bit about observations from working in my current role as a researcher, addressing knowledge and data gaps, but also formerly when I was working on policy for the United Nations Refugee Agency and behind the scenes of the Nansen Initiative. So in this talk, my title is Not Climate Refugees, the links between the climate crisis and human mobility. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this presentation, it's that first bit, the not climate refugees. But to start out, I want to get personal. So this is an image of where my aunt and uncle used to live in California. On October 7th, 2017, at 3 a.m., their neighbor came and pounded at their door, shouting fire. They grabbed their passport, their laptops, and they fled the flames. And this is what their community looks like today. So actually today they're recovering. This was immediately after the fire. They're doing okay, and they are completely the lucky ones. They have the resources and the resilience to bounce back. But many around our world are not so fortunate. And it's important to recognize that climate displacement is very much a current and a global challenge. So according to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, 23.9 million people were displaced because of weather-related hazards, including fires, storms, extreme temperatures in the year 2019 alone. So these are events that we know are increasing in intensity and in frequency because of climate change. However, there is not equity across the globe in terms of where these impacts are most severe. And as you can see in this regional distribution, the places that have committed the least in terms of historical anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions are the places that have the highest numbers of displacement. And on this slide, it's also important to recognize that most people who are displaced because of climate change are IDPs. They're internally displaced within a country's borders, and that these impacts are not equal. So today I want to do two things. First, I want to separate fact from fiction and provide a bit of context about these complex linkages between, on the one hand, climate change, and on the other, human mobility, including refugee crises. And second, I want to provide a bit of an overview of the landscape of international policy to showcase where governments are taking action and where they could take more action. So first, it's really easy, and I'm sure you've seen this in the headlines of newspapers, to equate this simple causal equation of climate change impacts equals mobility. Anyone who's living within 50 meters of the coastline is obviously going to be moving because of climate change impacts. Well, in reality, it's a much more complicated story, and academics, policymakers, the general civil society community are coming together to realize that there are a lot of reasons why these links are tenuous. And it's important when we are communicators and activists and advocates to understand some of these nuances. So first, there is a diverse range of climate change impacts, and I know everyone in the Fridays for the Future community is very familiar with these. But for the purposes of understanding how humans are moving, human mobility, it's important to draw a distinction between these sudden onset hazards that might lead to immediate displacement, like storms and floods and wildfires, and some of these more slow onset changes, like droughts, melting permafrost, sea level rise, that have different implications for how people are moving. Climate change also undermines human ability to have a livelihood. If you are raising your animals on a piece of cropland and, for instance, saline intrusion, there is water that has infiltrated the soil, it might not be possible to continue with your historical, your ancestral livelihood. Water availability, as in the story that I mentioned earlier, has profound implications for whether or not people can remain in a piece of land. Finally, climate change is increasing, as an increasing body of evidence demonstrates, in some cases, conflict and competition over scarce resources. So it might be a contributor or a threat multiplier for conflict. However, climate change impacts are rarely the sole driver of human mobility. People move for multiple reasons and intersecting reasons. Perhaps it's political persecution or armed conflict. Maybe it's a new job, economic opportunities. Maybe it's love, maybe it's education. The role of climate change influences these other factors that drive human mobility. And it's important to keep this in mind. Climate change is rarely the sole factor for why people move, but it may be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And finally, refugees and displaced persons who've already had to flee their homes for other reasons may face secondary displacement related to climate change. This is an image from Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh. These camps are often located on some of the most vulnerable land that has already, it's the least desirable land for others, and is very susceptible to cyclones and other natural hazards associated with climate change. Climate change movements also fall along a spectrum, from forced on the one hand to voluntary on the other. However, even though international law requires that we put people into these categories, in reality, it's a far more complicated picture. And most movements fall somewhere in between these two extremes. But for the purposes of trying to make policy action and policy discussions, this is the set of categories amidst that landscape of complexity that most often is referred to. So human mobility is an umbrella term within which there are a number of subcategories. As I mentioned, displacement, situations where people are predominantly forced to flee their homes. Migration, which are situations where people have some degree of agency. And in fact, migration is a very normal human activity, and it can be an adaptation mechanism to climate change. So for instance, when one member of a household has moved abroad, they can send home remittances, and those remittances, that money, can actually help their households to cope with future climate change impacts. There are some populations, however, who lack the resources to migrate, who are unable to use migration as an adaptation mechanism. This category of trapped populations may also be of as much concern to global policymakers. So we shouldn't always assume that simple equation that I mentioned earlier, where climate change impacts equals movement. Often it's a more complicated story. And a final category is planned relocation. So these are examples where entire communities are being relocated, for instance, to higher land. In Fiji, Vunilagoa is a village that has moved with the support of the government to a safer location away from the coastlines. These are really important to keep in mind, and these instances of planned relocation can be incredibly complicated, and a human rights-based approach where a community's needs are front and center is essential to make sure that it doesn't become a form of displacement. Okay, so when we talk about the refugee crisis, we're mostly talking about this first category, displacement. And I already mentioned that most situations of displacement because of climate change impacts are internal. People are not fleeing across borders. So usually, when I used to work at UNHCR, the most frequently asked question from journalists, from students, from colleagues was, okay, so are these people climate refugees? Well, again, it's a more complicated story. The 1951 Refugee Convention defines a refugee as someone with a well-founded fear of persecution for one of 5 reasons: their race, their religion, their nationality, their membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Ordinarily, in climate change contexts, people who are fleeing their homes don't meet this criteria of persecution for one of these 5 categories, these 5 grounds. There are exceptions, for instance, under regional conventions that have broader definitions, or where there is overlapping conflict and armed violence, as well as famine or protracted disaster like a drought. Somalia, for instance, there was an al-Shabaab insurgency and protracted famine and drought. these populations were able to seek refugee status. But I share this example because it's an exception. In the vast majority of contexts, the Refugee Convention is not applicable. So then people usually ask, okay, well, why don't we just change the convention? It was written in 1951. We live in 2020. A lot has changed. Well, in fact, the Refugee Convention was originally developed for a very specific purpose. It was developed post-World War II, and it actually had a geographic bound focused just on Europe and a temporal bound, only a couple years of applicability. It has changed in the past. Unfortunately, however, in today's political climate, there is very little political appetite. As you know, there's a lot of xenophobia, a lot of intolerance, and there's a real risk that if the convention was opened up for renegotiation, the outcome would be a far weaker protection document, and that even persons who are able to seek refugee status today might not be protected. So there's emerging consensus over the past few decades that there's no silver bullet solution to climate change related displacement. We can't just change the convention. However, the international community is making progress. In 2012, there was an initiative called the Nansen Initiative that was launched by Switzerland and Norway, predominantly by states. And what they were trying to do is create a home for this issue of climate displacement that previously had no home in international law, in institutions, and in the community of action. So what they did was a bottom-up consultation process. They went to the Pacific. They went to all of the hotspots, including the Pacific, to Central America, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And together, after this global dialogue, in 2015, 109 governments endorsed this protection agenda. This is a document that discusses the rights of people who've been displaced across borders because of climate change. And from 2016 onwards, a platform on disaster displacement has followed up to this process. And this platform seeks to coordinate across actors, across UN agencies, across governments, across civil society, across academics, to try to build consensus about what is necessary to address this challenge. And there is a toolbox of international policy approaches. Don't need to go into these here, but just so you're aware, this issue of climate change and human mobility touches upon so many different spheres, so many different areas of global action. There's the climate change Paris Agreement, for instance, which created a task force on displacement, which was the first time this issue of displacement was addressed in the UNFCCC process. There is something called the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which outlines pathways for what governments and other actors can do to support people who are moving, to make sure that it can be voluntary when people want it to be voluntary. The Global Compact on Refugees, in contrast, provides an overview of how people who are displaced, including in contexts where climate change is a root cause of refugee movements, can seek protection. So again, there are lots of different instruments. This is policy jargon. The point here is that there have been a lot of global commitments, but very little implementation. So where is action needed? Where are the next steps? There is a lot that governments are already doing, but there's a lot more that governments, civil society, and academics can do to accelerate this area. First, addressing knowledge and data gaps. There is a lot that we know, but there's also a lot that we don't know about how people are displaced, where they are moving, and what their needs are over time. Second, we need to allocate more funding for adaptation and for risk reduction. No one wants to leave their homes. Well, most of the time people don't want to leave their homes. So there's a lot that can be done to build higher seawalls, to put houses on stilts. These types of adaptation activities can ensure people can stay where they are and are not forcibly displaced at a later date. In extreme contexts, this third category that I mentioned earlier, planned relocations or managing retreats to move communities out of harm's way in advance of future displacement. as a measure of last resort. I think that's the important thing to remember about planned relocation. It's a measure of last resort. And third, we need to address legal and operational gaps to protect people who have been displaced by disasters, regardless of whether they're displaced internally or across borders. People who have had to leave their homes because of climate change or any other reason deserve to be treated with respect and with dignity. And addressing these legal and operational gaps is an important way to do that. And fourth, it's important that we raise awareness and global consciousness about this challenge of climate displacement. Right now, we find ourselves in a third crisis, a COVID crisis, independent from the refugee crisis and the climate crisis. And we're really being called upon to reconceptualize our identities and to reconceptualize this idea of global connectedness. We have a chance to be architects and to build a future world in which we see people not because of the passport they carry or the color of their skin, but because of the human being that they are. And as we are trying to reconcile what it means to be a human during this time, it's an important opportunity to rethink what it means and how we relate to to other people on this planet, including those who've been forcibly displaced. We need to change this narrative. And the best way to do that is to talk about what it means to be displaced and how fortunate we are to have a home when we do have one. So what are some ways forward? Well, as I've mentioned in this presentation, the links between climate crisis and human mobility are complicated. It's not a simple causal equation. Talking about these challenges is really important. So when you go and you talk to your family members at the dinner table tonight, or when you're talking to your friends, maybe ask them this question. If you were going to leave your home tonight, what would you grab? What would you take with you? Start to think about these processes. Second, we need more coordinated action. We need to have coordination across policy spheres that I've mentioned earlier. Across time, we need action that is preventive as well as reactive. We need to have a paradigm shift about how we think about these challenges to make sure that we are minimizing the risks of displacement as well as addressing displacement. And we also need coordination across different theories of change. There are so many different ways that we can get governments to act on this challenge. There are so many different tools that we have. And you all, as incredible activists in the Fridays for Future movement, are aware that we need to be thinking across the board. We need to be on the streets. We need to be in writing papers, journalists, urban planners who are building more resilient cities that can welcome people who've been displaced with open arms. We need all hands on deck. And that's my final message, is that there is really a role for everyone to play in addressing these enormous challenges of climate displacement and the connections between climate crisis and refugee crisis more broadly. As one of my favorite quotes that I'd like to conclude on, the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands once said, "To fail to plan is to plan to fail." We need all hands on deck to make sure we are planning and we are preparing ahead today. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. So just as a first follow-up question, how do you think that the consequences of climate change affect refugee settlement specifically in terms of safety and resource accessibility?
Fantastic, thank you for that question. Well, as I mentioned in the slide with an image about the Rohingya refugee communities that are currently based in Bangladesh, actually I'm going to stop sharing my slides. Oftentimes, refugee settlements are in places that are the least desirable land and are often most exposed to hazards like floods and storms and droughts. And they are often, in extreme cases, forcibly displaced a second time because of these hazards. There is a lot that can be done to make sure that these communities have access to resources and, as you're saying, accessibility to the needs that they have. It comes first and foremost from this paradigm shift that I've mentioned earlier. We need to be anticipating challenges about climate change and disasters in advance. We can't just have this old mindset that humanitarians use of reaction, putting band-aids on situations. We need to think in advance about how we can make sure that these communities have access to the resources that they need and that we're already prepared to respond to these challenges. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that answers it perfectly. Thank you. Now, I know you touched upon this a bit earlier in your presentation, but I'm wondering, who are the people the most likely to be displaced? Where do they live, and what are their financial and social resources?
This is an excellent question. As I've mentioned, there are a number of hotspots around the world. Pacific Islands, small island developing states are one. Sub-Saharan Africa, areas that are exposed to protracted droughts are another. But in reality, any country might be impacted by climate change impacts. What's important to realize is that there is an equality in how these impacts are felt by human beings. Disasters aren't natural. They're mitigated because of pre-existing vulnerabilities. So, for instance, people who are the poorest, who are on the margins of society to begin with, often bear the brunt of climate change impacts and climate displacement. This is first and foremost an issue of climate justice. And I think when we're thinking about how we approach this challenge of climate displacement, it's important to realize that both within countries and across countries, the impacts are not felt equally. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Red. Very wonderful and informative answer. Okay, so we'd like to ask a quick question to both of you, if you guys would both like to give a quick answer to this. So what are some examples that y'all can think of some recent events that have caused big waves of migration, and more specifically, big waves of migration that can be linked to climate change in some sort of direct way?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, these links between climate change and a migration are really complicated for a couple of reasons. First, because we don't have enough attribution science to say a single drought is directly because of climate change. We know it's increasing in intensity and frequency because of climate change, but it's hard to make that direct causal link. And second, it's, as I mentioned, complicated to say a single climate disaster directly causes movement because people are moving for so many complicated and interconnected ways. With those caveats out of the way, I think the answer to your question is many. So first, very recently in Vanuatu, which is a small island in the Pacific, Cyclone Harold devastated the island, and predominantly internal displacement, but many people lost their homes. So this is internal movements, not across borders. A second challenge, recent crisis that's important to highlight, in Somalia, there has been protracted, ongoing drought and famine that overlaps with the insurgency of Al-Shabaab, which was a militant group. So because of these combined factors, there have been thousands and thousands of in this case, they were in fact refugees who fled across the border to Kenya to Dadaab refugee camp. So this is another example that illustrates how complicated these challenges of climate change and human mobility are, but that there are links, and these numbers are astounding.
I would like to add to what Erica said, that we can see that in developed countries, it's more easy to deal with natural disasters. If we see what's happening in the United States with Katrina, with these big fires happening, I am afraid that if this would happen at smaller countries of Africa that had weakest state to help people to find jobs for them, it would be much easier. People couldn't do anything more than to migrate. So we have to see that in the next years, this will be worse, as we understand now. And we must think about that as countries, as the state. We will be prepared for that to make sure that people will not be forced to leave, because everybody knows that nobody wants to leave his home. So we must be prepared for that.
Thank you so much for your answers. Now, I know that Erica talked a bit about this, but I'd like to hear Michael's view on it as well. And that is, what type of support is the most needed for refugees? And what can I, as a young person, do to help? Michael, would you like to start?
I think that this could be the question to end our chat, but I will give you the answer now. I think that also what Erica said is the social movement. I think that we must increase people, the society, the civil society, to talk to the people and try to find out how we can help that. I think that living in Lesbos and in Greece and in Europe, the last 4 or 5 years, we lost the game politically. So we need the society to understand what's going on and try to push politicians that we know that they rule the situation to more friendly to policies about refugees, so that we can stand for them.
Thank you. That's a great point. Now, Erica, would you like to talk more specifically on what young people can do?
Sure, thanks. And I'm just echoing what Michael said. I think there are so many ways in which there are so many gaps, right? We can be addressing these knowledge and data gaps. We can be addressing the political gaps of political will. We can be addressing gaps in consciousness and in our discourse, in our conversations, raising awareness. I think there are so many entry points for young people in particular, and also for society, for people more broadly. And I think, what can young people do in particular? Many things. Talk to your parents, talk to your family members, talk to your friends, raise awareness about these challenges. Second, we can, when we're talking and we're making advocacy claims to the various actors that I know the Fridays for the Future movement is engaging with, we need to think about more than just mitigation, more than just limiting climate change impacts. Of course, we need to keep to a 1.5 degree target as much as possible, aligned to the latest science, but we also need to be proactively thinking about climate change adaptation and about providing compensation for losses and damages. So if I was a young person in your shoes, these are the types of requests I would be making to government leaders. And third, I think it's really important for young people to be thinking about, who am I and what do I want to be doing with my life? I mentioned earlier in the first conversation that, did you hear that noise? There was a crash outside. It's important to realize that you have so many opportunities in the next decade of your lives to make decisions about what you want to be doing, and that there is a role for you regardless of whether you want to be a lawyer, an urban planner, a journalist. There are so many important entry points to address this challenge. And in the Fridays for Future movement, I think a lot of people of all ages are realizing that there is hope for the future, and that together we can build societies that are more resilient, that do allow people to move voluntarily when they want to, in safe and orderly ways, but also when they are forcibly displaced, protect their rights and support them to find solutions with dignity. And I think that young people can play a really important role in driving these types of changes that we need to see forwards. Thanks.
Thank you. I love that. Now, Michael, you live in Lesbos in Greece, which is a holding station for refugees coming from the Middle East and from Africa to seek asylum in Europe, if I'm right. And I know you're going to speak more on the situation in Lesbos a bit later, but for now I have a question for you. In what ways have you seen that the corona crisis affects migration and refugees, and how does climate change exacerbate it?
We can understand that exposed to natural disasters much more than we do. Okay, when we have the big floods in the island, on the island that I live, okay, it can be dangerous for me, but I will stay at my sweet home without getting out, just saying that I cannot move my car. But these people, thousands of people that they're living in their tents, you understand that it's not easy to deal with that. Same problems we had 3 years before with that. We had snow here. That's very rare, once every 10 years, I don't know. And 3 years before, we had in 2016, we had a very bad winter. We had 3-4 times in the winter that we had snow, and people couldn't get warm in the tents, and some of them have died because they were exposed to so much bad weather. The heating system, there was no heating system, or they're using very bad things to burn, to heat themselves. So we have deaths. So we understand that the same situation that these people are moving for years. If you are talking with them, you'll see that they have started their route to reach the dream of Europe maybe 1 or 2 or 3 years before, and they are moving and they are working in the countries that they are crossing by, and they try to make money. So always they are exposed to bad weather. So we understand that if anything is happening and it's a problem for us once, for them it's much worse.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about specifically on the Corona crisis and how that impacts refugees.
We are lucky that on the island and generally in Greece, we don't have much. We don't have many incidents of corona in here, and especially at the detention centers that we have here on the island. That there are about 20,000 people stuck in terrible conditions. You can understand that if something will happen, it will be disaster, and they try to self-organize themselves. We were in quarantine the past 45 days, everyone in Greece, and they also were like. I saw that they also were frightened because they understood that they could get infected only by Greeks, by us, because there were some policemen that they are getting in the camp, or medical people. These would get the corona into the camp. We were lucky till now, and we keep our fingers crossed, and we don't have many problems still in Greece. Let's hope that this will go on like that. But it's very dangerous. You understand?
Mm-hmm. So to go a little bit on a separate topic from that, but more specifically towards refugees in general, what are your personal opinion on Greece's and European Union's efforts to act in the recent 2010s refugee crisis that was in the news so frequently? And on top of that, how do you think that they could have improved their response?
I will say a few things about that in my presentation, but what is really interesting is that you can see the change of the policy of the European Union and also Greece about the issue the last 10 years. And this is a political issue, how we saw in 2015 that about 800,000 people have crossed the borders only to Greece. And you remember what was happening in Germany with people waiting for them at the train stations, and maybe 500,000 of refugees have gone only to Germany. And what happened the next year when the borders were closed and the situation, the policy of the European Union has changed, and now we are seeing that we can see that in a full scale. Borders are closed. I'm afraid that this is the original idea in the European Union to close the borders and push the problem out of us. keep the problem at Libya and at Turkey, or maybe the islands of the Aegean Sea at Greece. We try to push the problem, try to make fences and walls around. We don't say that openly, because we understand that this is very good, not good. This is not good for our profile, our democratic and social profile. But they are following this policy, and this is very bad. For me, I would say that again later. The problem is political, and it's a problem that Europe has to deal with. That we were always dealing with that case, and I think it's more social problem than anything else, that we have to deal with society and try to make politicians understand what's going on there.
Thank you so much. Now, I believe that Michael has some pictures prepared that he wants to show us. So, Michael, please go ahead.
Yes, I have a short presentation, and I will make a few comments on pictures that I have taken the past 10 years or more about the refugee crisis and people that they have come to our island the past years. Okay. So you can see that this is the city of Mytilene. It's the capital of Lesbos. This picture was taken in 2012. It's when on November of 2012, it was a big problem with war in Syria. So it was the start of big flows of people coming to Europe through our island. This is a child that these people, there were no camps, there were no place to host them. When people were coming, were just sleeping at the streets. So this is one child from that area. I have a few numbers that I will not say a lot, but just to give the numbers and have an idea of what's happening. In fact, these are statistics from UNHCR that you can find them openly in internet. This is on the 3rd of May 2020. You can see the number of people that have come the past years in Greece. You can see the sea arrivals with a maximum of 2015 when we had 856, you see. And it was the big flow, the maximum people that they have arrived. Imagine that these days in 2015, about 600,000 have come only on Lesbos Island. And on October of 2015, that it was the maximum rate of coming of the people, there were about 100,000 people that they have come only on Lesbos. Imagine that Lesbos is an island of 90,000 people, so it was about more than 3,000 per day that they were coming by boat. You know that we are very close to the Asian coast, about 6 miles, something like that. So it was easy for the people to come, but not so easy because, as you may know, that we had a lot of deaths also with wrecks and people that they have lost on their mind. After 2015, we can see that the numbers are very low. So in 2016, we had about 173, and we see the next years that the numbers are very low. And this is the same picture for Italy, that we had big numbers in 2015, 2016, and now it's going down more and more and more. What I want to say is that the past 3-4 years, the numbers are really low. But these 3 years, it was the big demonstrations and the alt-right movement of the people trying to show that, check what's happening. We have invasion of the people coming. but in reality, the numbers are very, very low. It's the lowest numbers the past decades that we have. This is Greek. You understand it. It's Greek also originally, but I want to show that just to say this is the census of Greece that in 2011 we had about 600,000 people coming from Balkans before what happened with refugees coming from Syria and etc. the last years. We always had migration in Greece and in Europe, and this is true. This is the same thing that we can see that the numbers of the people that they were coming was always like that. In 2015, that we had the flow, we had in Europe about 1 million people that they have arrived. Europe, as you know, has a population of 500 million of people. So 1 million is nothing, okay? At the biggest flow of refugees after World War II. That everybody says that. But we understand that if we see that with cold blood, the number is not big. And people around, if the people could move in all the countries of Europe, that wouldn't cause any problem, I think. This is the first picture I have. This is Hellenic police in 2009, when the people coming on the island were arrested. So it was, my son was 1 year old, so it was, for me, very hard to see people and kids being arrested and getting them to jail. The next years, as the numbers of the people who were coming were increased, they understood that they couldn't jail everyone. They had no room at the jails to get them all in. So people were starting, this picture was taken in 2012, that Syrians were coming more, and they understood that they should make camps and do something with these people. They couldn't put them in jail because everybody's seeking asylum, and as you know, you can't get people seeking asylum in prison. So we are trying to move the people as fast as they could. And more or less it was working these years from 2012 to 2015. Another crucial factor is the solidarity. This is a picture of 2015, but a lot of thousands of people have arrived on the island, and you can understand that there was no infrastructure, especially in Greece, that we were in the middle of economic financial crisis, to host all these people. So a lot of people have come all over the world. Thousands of people have come on the island of Lesbos and in other places of Greece to help the refugees. And it was really very important moments that we lived, that we saw a lot of people trying to help, and we were humans at this period. And otherwise, the whole game, it would be a disaster. This is a picture of November of 2015, when we had a big wreck that we lost, I think, about 80 people out of Lesbos. And it was a common prayer of Catholics and Orthodox and Muslims about and you can understand that it's not happening every day, but the spirit of humanity was working to anyone, even these people that some people were against migrants and refugees. Everybody was saying that okay, we are talking about humans and we have to do something with that. It's a picture of a friend that has arrived on the island, and she has been at the beach, and accidentally a boat came once, and she tried to help this guy that he has come, and my friend here was speaking French and tried to translate that to the doctor that was helping him and try to understand what's going on, because the doctor also was Israeli from an NGO, a doctor that she has come to help on the island. As I said before, thousands of people have come to help the people, and so really this solidarity movement was great and helped a lot. People are moving because they have no other way to do to save their lives. This picture, which was taken in winter of 2015 and 16, is a family of Afghanistan that I was talking about. You can see that this guy has no feet and he has a child that is wheelchair, and people are really desperate. I have a friend, Mohammedi, who is still living. He's an Afghan. He has come here in 2004. He has a family in Afghanistan. He has a son there. So in 2011, I think that his son was about 2 years old, like mine. And I was asking him, why don't you go there and get your family? Under bureaucracy, it was very difficult. It's still very difficult that he can go there and get his family and his son legally in Greece. So he was telling me that he couldn't do it. He was trying to make his papers. So I asked him, why don't you take them with a boat like you did? Okay, your wife and your son. So he looked at me with a face saying that I cannot do that. Can you understand really how dangerous it is to get these people on a boat and get them from Turkey? Even me, that I was involved in that, I thought that, okay, to get your family, you can do it, but he wasn't, and he has never taken them, and he's still trying legally to get these people. So these people are not moving like fun, okay? They don't want to move, they just want to stay to their countries, and they are desperate. That's why they are doing it. And a lot of people are losing their lives. This is a picture from the cemetery that it was made for refugees because there was a problem in 2015 and 16. In 2015, I think that in Mediterranean we had about 4,000 people lost their lives, and in 2016 there were more than 5,000. So you understand that at the beach of Lesbos, so there were a lot of people that they were losing their lives, and they made the cemetery special for them. Some of them, they even have no names. Okay, they have some numbers, and of course they are kids, they are families that they have moved, hundreds of people that they were moved like that. This is a recent picture that I have taken last month when we had the new government in Greece that they want to make more strict closing centers, detention centers at the islands, and everybody was against them because there are so many thousands of people here, and you know, as I said before, they are trying to push the problem to the borders, and this is happening. And I say that to the people that they are alt-right here, that they are following the same thing, that Europe is closing the borders to keep them in Greece. Greece is closing the borders to keep the people on Lesbos, and we in Lesbos, we are closing the border to keep them away from us to Moria. That's a small village of 1,000 people, and now there are about 20,000 refugees there. And with this whole situation going on, with these articles that they were written, with this push that there was on the people, imagine that leaving these desperate people, 20,000 people like that in terrible conditions. Of course, we had problems with illegal activities, and people are against them, and when the alt-right people are pushing them. So this is the picture of March, when people were against these people coming with a boat, and they were trying to send them away. So we are now living this situation on the island, officially, and this is very bad, by the Greek government, who is trying with pushbacks to send the people away. The past days, we had also some news that they have taken boats from the islands of Chios and Samos, and they have taken refugees back to the Turkey, of course, illegally, without doing that officially, of course, but there are 3 or 4 incidents that for sure this has happened. We were talking before about civil society and how we must talk. So these are some Facebook comments. The Greeks will understand that what it's written about me, of course, threatening me or threatening people that they try to help refugees. But we have to stand up and we have to keep working on that. And we cannot stay weak and stay silent, because I really understand that this is the time that we must take the responsibility to help these people. So we cannot let them win the next day. This is Moria Center, more or less. This is how these people are living there. This was taken last December, and you can see all these garbages and how these people are trying to make their lives and try to continue their life. Normally, when I'm going there, I go with a very bad feelings, but I can assure you that the strength of the people, the strength about life, that life is going on, is giving us courage. So we have to think about that each one of them is a human person, and each one of them wants to continue his life or her life, and especially the children's life, that they just want a better future for their children. So it's not numbers, it's not things that we are talking about, but humans that they want something better for their life. And life is going on. This is a picture, a girl from Iran that one day I found her in the camp. You see that the tents, the summer tents, in fact, that she was living, and she has taken her small puppy from Jolie from Iran. She was very happy. It's a girl well educated from the University of Tehran, and life is going on. She is still hoping that she can make her life better. And this is the spirit that I want to send, that we have the responsibility we must have the responsibility to save the game, to talk to the people, to move the society in a way to not to stay silent. We have seen that in many cases in the past, and you know, Nikos Kazantzakis, a famous Greek author, but he has written that you must love responsibility. You must be responsible to save the world. If the world is not saved, you will be responsible for that. So I think that I want to send this message to the young people around the world, facing the case of climate change and environmental problems, but also about the refugees problem that we see around. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all this with us. I really appreciate it, and I can say that I learned a lot from the session, and I feel like I've been given a new insight in what the refugee crisis actually looks like.
Yes, the same. Thank you two so much for being here and being able to share your like genuinely intricate and expansive knowledge on, this interdisciplinary subject with us as well as with everyone that's watching right now and with the larger climate movement. It's certainly a huge benefit to everyone. So thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you so much for organizing this and for making these important but complicated links. And I think the point that you've made, Michael, about how behind these numbers and statistics are intensely human stories is the single most important takeaway from this presentation. And as we're thinking about climate change and displacement and building a better world, realizing that these are human beings that need to be treated with dignity first and foremost is critical.
I completely agree. And please remember that this is a recurring thing that we have. So please tune in next Friday for the next webinar.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.